Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping right into a pretty high voltage conversation today about power, money, and control.
It's a big one.
Yeah. Our sources are packed with some really candid discussions from major figures in media and tech, and our mission is simple. We want to give you a shortcut to understanding three very charged topics.
We're going to unpack the boardroom battles for old media empires.
Exactly, the multi-billion-dollar ones. Then we'll get into the mechanics behind the rise of online firebrands, and finally, this growing sort of unified conservative skepticism toward AI.
That's a massive mandate. And what's great about our source material, it's excerpts from the All In podcast featuring Tucker Carlson, is just how unfiltered it is. It let the hosts really dive deep into corporate finance, the roots of identity politics, and these profound technological risks without the usual constraints. You get a real sense of what the people who own the platforms are actually worried about.
And to set the stage for that conversation about who controls the flow of information, let's start with a surprisingly relevant little anecdote. It involves President Trump.
Okay.
Apparently, at a White House Christmas party, he brought people up on stage to brainstorm names for AI. He was just tossing out ideas like Trump superintelligence or American intelligence.
What stands out there, beyond just the humor of it, is the insight into his operating style. The hosts observed that he is, and I'm quoting, a lot of fun to work for.
Right.
But more importantly, he's uncontrollable. If his advisors tell him he's not allowed to talk to certain people, it doesn't work. It just makes him want to talk to them even more.
And that idea right there, that tension between centralized control and this radical, unmanageable defiance, that's the current that runs through everything we're looking at today.
From Hollywood CEOs trying to control debt.
To online figures who refuse to be deplatformed, and then finally to AI, which, no one seems to know how to control at all.
So let's start with the centralizers then. The high-stakes financial fight engulfing Hollywood.
Okay, let's unpack this by setting the scene with Warner Bros. Discovery, or WBD. They own fantastic intellectual property, HBO, DC, all those classic films.
And the cable assets, CNN, TNT, Discovery.
Right. But this incredible portfolio is saddled with $30 billion of debt. And that debt is the engine that's driving this entire M&A crisis.
The debt is the vulnerability. It's what invited the vultures, so to speak. And we saw two radically different offers come in.
Okay, so who was first?
First, you have the 800-pound gorilla, Netflix. They came in with an $83 billion offer.
But only for the streaming assets.
Exactly, just the streaming. And WBD actually accepted that publicly at first.
But then
Paramount and Skydance, they launch what is basically a massive hostile bid. $108 billion in cash for the entire company.
Including those supposedly irrelevant cable assets.
Including everything. And the financing is just staggering. It includes $41 billion in equity from the Ellison family and significant sovereign wealth funds from the Middle East.
And the market is actually betting on that one, right?
It is. Polymarket currently favors the Paramount bid at 51%, with Netflix at 36%. But let's zoom in on that $100 billion question. Why is this specific deal size so revealing about the state of culture?
That's the key insight from the sources. These huge $100 billion plus deals, they're underwritten by debt. They are fundamentally bets on the past.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, they're leveraging guaranteed library IP, the back catalog of HBO, of DC against future debt payments. It's a classic financial play. You're just hoping to sweat those old assets for another decade.
It's the total opposite of a future bet. Contrast this with, say, when Google bought YouTube or Facebook bought Instagram. Those were the culture-shaping deals.
And they were barely $1 billion.
Exactly. The difference in valuation tells you everything. The WBD bid is about consolidating finance and library assets, not about building the next generation of conversation.
Which brings us to that really provocative viewpoint the hosts shared, that traditional news brands like CBS News and CNN are effectively just husks.
Brands without substance.
Yeah.
Genuinely irrelevant for winning hearts and minds among the general public.
They argue the real threat to, cultural conversation and democracy lies not in who owns those legacy outlets,
but in the censorship potential of the big centralized platforms, YouTube and X.
Yeah.
If you can't get your message out of the platforms people actually use, owning CNN is, It's meaningless.
I do appreciate that perspective, but doesn't it miss a crucial point? I mean, cable news viewership is low, sure, only about 4 million total across CBS and CNN.
Right.
But those brands, they still set the narrative for legacy politicians, for regulators. Doesn't that mean their ownership is still critically important for shaping the decisions of the ruling class, even if they aren't winning hearts and minds on TikTok?
That's a fair point. You have to distinguish between cultural relevance and political influence. But the source material really emphasizes that for the common person, the antitrust concerns are more pressing. And they're much greater with Netflix because they're already that 800-pound gorilla.
And you also had the pushback from creators themselves. The Hollywood unions, WGA and SAG, they oppose the Netflix deal. They're afraid of job cuts and worse conditions.
And why is that?
Yeah.
It's because Netflix is famous for offering showrunners a salary, but zero equity. No back-end residuals.
It just completely erodes that historical entrepreneurial aspect of creating a show.
It turns creators into wage laborers.
Yeah.
Exactly. And finally, you have the political scrutiny around the Paramount deal. The Ellison family are known major supporters of Donald Trump.
So their bid for CBS and CNN, it certainly raises the appearance of a quid pro quo, doesn't it?
It does, though, again, the counterargument is that those cable channels are just so small, their influence is probably overstated anyway.
So, we have centralized power struggling to keep its relevance in Hollywood. But let's zoom out. What happens when power decentralizes and, well, gets weaponized by firebrands operating completely outside those traditional systems?
This takes us directly to the phenomenon of the online celebrity firebrand. And the example here is Nick Fuentes. He's a 27-year-old white nationalist with a huge following on Rumble.
And he's extremely successful at broadcasting his deeply controversial views.
Yeah, describing himself as totally racist, believing women shouldn't vote, and being highly critical of organized Jewry.
The source material provides a really telling origin story for him, though, which illustrates the danger of trying to censor people.
Right, his activism began after he mildly criticized Congress over Israel when he was in college.
And when he was attacked and deplatformed by a major figure like Ben Shapiro, the response wasn't containment. Instead, the views were pushed into the dark where they, quote, festered and became really ugly.
The act of trying to silence a moderate viewpoint became the fuel for his identity politics.
And what's crucial to understand is why he resonates with his 500,000 followers, who he calls gropers.
He's described as funny, smart, a great broadcaster. But his core appeal is that defiance. It's that up yours buddy attitude that speaks to young men who feel like they've grown up with constant hectoring.
He's tapping directly into the disaffectedness of youth who are struggling with the costs of healthcare, education, homeownership.
And this defiance, it brings us to the core problem they identified: tribalism. The hosts argued that Fuentes is a direct expression of identity politics, and that the only alternative to being, as they put it, governed by the mafia, is being governed by universal principles that apply to every American citizen equally.
That's the key philosophical distinction they're making. America First, in this context, isn't a political movement. It's the simple, necessary governing principle that a democratic republic ought to act on behalf of its own citizens.
And if a society governs based on identity, you'll inevitably get competing identity politics, including white identity politics. Yeah, that's the argument. And to address that complexity, the source material offered a solution to racialized society. So what does that actually mean?
To be perfectly clear, it means basing all rewards, all treatment, all opportunities strictly on non-DNA factors, on merit, on shared principles, on contribution.
To prevent the kind of fragmentation that identity politics guarantees, the argument is if your society rewards you based on skin color or origin, that society is heading towards a dangerous place. And they cited historical examples like Rwanda.
Now here is where the story shifts. It goes from an organic cultural phenomenon to something more strategic.
Right. The source material notes that this movement is not entirely organic. There's research showing coordinated amplification efforts.
And these are largely unverified social media accounts from several developing countries, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, places like that.
It raises a really important question. Who is paying for the brigading? It's not just organic superfans driving this content. It's an engine designed to create division and dissent.
It suggests a deep inorganic effort. potentially by foreign actors, like Russia, who
Mhm.
just want to ferment chaos and push this toxic stuff to the front of the news cycle.
Yeah, it makes you realize how many of the fights we're having online aren't even real arguments. They're just synthetic noise being generated somewhere else.
We also got a really illuminating insight from an immigrant perspective on this whole issue of national identity.
Mm. The Canadian model versus the American one.
Exactly. The Canadian toss salad multiculturalism versus the American melting pot. It created cultural confusion, too many long tail holidays, and it ultimately slowed the country down. It had a real impact on GDP and foreign direct investment.
So the strong message here is that agreeing on a shared American culture, a core set of values, is crucial for societal speed and stability.
That shared culture creates a societal speed bump. It lets the country act collectively and protect itself against the kind of tribalism that external actors are trying to fuel.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Moving on now to our third subject, we find that same tension between control and chaos, but applied to technology. We see this curious paradox. Why are historically free market, low regulation conservatives suddenly anti-AI?
They argue the risks just far outweigh the technological benefits, and they articulate three major distinct
Okay,
risks.
what's the first one?
The first is just chaos, the concern over massive job loss, the energy draw, the overall disruption where, as the source described it, the fabric of reality itself begins to tear.
The second is the fear of control, the Orwellian risk. This is cited as the biggest worry. The awesome power that AI gives governments to enforce compliance, surveillance, repression.
Potentially leading to a social credit system.
Right. And the call is for guardrails, specifically to protect civil liberties and privacy before this technology is fully deployed.
And the third risk is ideological infiltration. They fear the requirement of DEI being programmed into AI, which is really just shorthand for fearing that the AI's training data and the people creating the models lean heavily in one ideological direction.
As we saw with the Black George Washington debacle at Google, if you bake in censorship and pre-filtering based on a pervasive ideology, you get factual errors, political bias, and a powerful vehicle for brainwashing.
That's the core fear, that the trust and safety censorship apparatus that big tech used on social media will be transferred directly into the foundational layer of AI.
But the hosts were also quick to point out where the AI industry itself failed. I mean, they have completely failed to market the dividend of AI to the average person.
No one is telling consumers why they should be excited. The promised benefits have to be tangible to overcome the fear.
We should be hearing about 80 to 90% cheaper education, goods delivered twice as fast at half the price.
And genuine breakthroughs in healthcare, living to 120, eliminating cancer, that abundance message has been completely lost.
And that lack of a perceived upside just fuels the primary anxiety, massive job displacement. Now, the expert perspective offered some cold comfort on this, didn't it?
It did. The Optimist data, it doesn't really bear out the fear yet. AI has only accounted for about 4.7% of self-reported layoffs year to date.
And there was a Yale study.
Yeah, Yale study showed no discernible disruption yet in the general labor market. And crucially, AI accounts for about half of current GDP growth.
So the timeline they suggested was what, 20 or 30 years?
Right. That job loss, if it happens, should occur over 20 or 30 years, giving society time to adapt.
I appreciate that historical perspective, but doesn't the speed of AI deployment, especially in specialized startups, mean that disruption isn't going to be linear? The pessimist reality, informed by VC funding, suggests that timeline is wildly wrong.
You're talking about the startups being funded specifically to replace roles.
Exactly. Sales development reps, customer support agents. We're talking about replacement cycles measured in months, not decades.
That's the disconnect. You have the macro data showing slow disruption, but then you have the anecdotal, boots-on-the-ground reality. Firms like Amazon estimating they could eliminate hundreds of thousands of jobs. We're seeing autonomous drive-thrus now.
And this is already reflected in rising youth unemployment for 16 to 24-year-olds. It's at 10.5%. That demographic is the first canary in the coal mine.
So if that disruption is happening fast, what are the immediate solutions for the workforce beyond just, waiting 30 years?
The primary actionable insight was the redirection of labor. Jobs that require marrying cognitive ability with physical dexterity, plumbers, electricians, construction, they're thriving.
And paying incredibly high wages, sometimes upwards of $500,000 or more, precisely because they're so difficult to automate.
And the most radical policy idea they discussed to manage this shift quickly was eliminating federal underwriting of student loans.
The argument being that this would allow the market to quickly shift people away from expensive, obsolete degrees and redirect them toward high-demand trades.
Which would then be subsidized or even paid for by the companies that are desperate for that labor.
You're letting the market fix the labor mismatch by removing the artificial floor for bad education. And finally, there was a consensus that universal basic income, UBI, is undesirable.
People need to feel useful. They need to contribute.
Right. Simply paying them to be content, it diminishes the necessity and the meaning of life.
Today's deep dive reveals a pretty clear pattern running through all three segments, whether we talked about media consolidation, political movements, or the acceleration of tech. The central tension is always between established, centralized power and radical disruption.
Yeah, the core concerns really center on who controls the flow of information. Is it legacy media,
Yeah.
decentralized firebrands,
Mm.
or the centralized big tech companies training the AI models?
And the second concern is profoundly economic. Who benefits from the vast structural changes that AI is bringing to the workforce?
That discussion about AI really highlighted those two competing forces. The desire for technological abundance, the Star Trek future, versus the fear of human repression, the Terminator future.
The greatest risk, as we heard, is not the technology itself. It's how concentrations of human power, whether it's governments or big tech, will use it to enforce compliance and diminish the average citizen's rights and privacy.
We heard this truly provocative, maybe even radical idea for managing AI-driven job displacement, that the America First movement, which is primarily designed to protect borders, could accidentally become the necessary economic solution.
How would that work?
If the country prioritizes deporting criminals and limiting legal immigration, it could keep the labor supply low enough to maintain low-end service jobs like dishwashers, nannies. Those jobs would then be forced to pay $30 to $40 an hour due to the limited domestic labor supply.
So protecting borders accidentally becomes the key to solving widespread domestic economic displacement, something for you to consider.
Thank you for going on the deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.